Good evening, good night for some of you, good morning perhaps if you're across the world. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation on queering peace and security, hosted in partnership by Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security and Conflict Transformation, the Canada chapter, the Canadian Coalition for Youth, Peace and Security, colleagues at EGAL Canada, Inter Perez, and the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. My name is Katrina Leclerc, and I am the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada. I'm calling in today from Tsawwassen First Nation out on our beautiful West Coast, and I'm deeply honored to be able to moderate this dialogue. Let me begin by offering some reflections to frame our conversation. June is often framed as a celebration of joy, of visibility, community, and of pride. But it's also one of those things where pride is also, and has always been, a protest. It's a protest born out of resistance to police brutality, state violence, and systemic exclusion. It's rooted in struggle and fueled by movements led by trans women of color and other queer folks whose names history often chooses to forget, but whose courage continues to shape our freedoms today. In the spirit of protest is especially necessary right now. Around the world, and here even in Canada, queer and trans communities are experiencing yet again attacks and increasing attacks against them through legislation, surveillance, criminalization, and everyday acts of violence. These attacks are not isolated. They are part of a broader backlash against social justice, gender equality, and the progress that many have fought so hard to achieve. And while the Women, Peace and Security and Youth, Peace and Security agendas aim to build more inclusive peace, queer people, especially those who are racialized, Indigenous, living with disabilities, are gender diverse, or at different intersectional identities, are still too often left out of the conversation. Their experiences are also seen as fringe, or their knowledge treated as optional. Their security is regarded as secondary. And that's why we're doing this event. That's why we needed to create space for this conversation to be had. We're here today to center queer voices, experiences, but also making sure that it is not a side note. It's an essential part of how we think about peace and security, to interrogate these institutions that we work within and with, and to imagine what it means to queer peace building itself, not just through our words, but really through our practice. So I want to acknowledge and thank the members of the Women, Peace and Security Canada, whose activism and vision led the idea of this panel. So we're glad to step up to the plate and be able to host when the WCAP's called, and thank them as well as CCYPS, Inter Perez, EGAL, and others for their contributions to our own network, which are reinforcing the inclusivity of our space. I'm also grateful that we have other allies who are joining us. You'll hear from them in a moment, who are committed to advancing women, peace and security, youth, peace and security from a queer lens. The conversation is inspired by longstanding work to advance 2S LGBTQ+ work and rights here at home and globally, and we're grateful to be building on this foundation. Before we begin, I have a few logistical notes, and then I'll pass it over to our speakers. The webinar here is on Zoom, of course, so we'll ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off by default. You may not even have the option to turn them on, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A box and share your questions with panelists as they speak. For the safety of our speakers and participants, the Q&A submissions are being moderated, and I want to be very clear and transparent. No harassment, hate speech, or discriminatory behavior will be tolerated at all during this event. This is a space of care and respect, and we will remove participants if they do not respect the issues at hand. This event is being recorded. All the speakers have given their consent, and we're grateful to them to be able to do so that their remarks can be shared online afterwards. Although this event is being conducted in English, si vous désirez poser une question en français lors de la section de la question et réponse, il me fera plaisir de traduire pour les panélistes et de pouvoir engager avec vous en français. With that, folks, let's begin. I'm pleased to now welcome Marie-Pierre Wade, the Deputy Director of Outreach in the Indo-Pacific Regional Coordination Division at Global Affairs Canada and former Chief of Staff to our near and dear Ambassador on Women, Peace and Security, who's recently finished her term. to offer some opening reflections. Thank you so much, Mary, for coming and for being a continued ally for us in this space. We're really glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité à participer à cette conversation qui est organisée par 3 organisations canadiennes importantes et très complémentaires qui œuvrent en faveur de l'inclusion dans le domaine de la paix et de la sécurité. Thank you for opening this event in the way that you did. I know that a lot of the things that you said really resonate with all of us calling in. And I know that we're coming into this discussion with the recognition of how critical it is for us to be connecting on inclusion, given the pushback and the setbacks that Katrina was referring to, and the role that groups with different identities can play to be allies to each other. I worked for several years in the Office of the Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security at Global Affairs Canada, and the way that we would frame the work on women, peace and security is that at its core, it's about inclusion. So we need to continuously think about whose security we're talking about, whose peace is being negotiated, and who is being left out. But despite this, we've heard from colleagues working at our missions at the UN or other multilateral fora reporting anecdotally that out of all of the issues that are extremely complex and difficult for finding common ground that they spend time negotiating on with delegations from around the world, it's gender and sexual orientation that remains some of the most sensitive topics and the most difficult to agree on in the work on norms and standards building. Queering the women, peace, and security agenda means many things, including recognizing that gender is not binary, that identities are complex and intersectional, and that we just can't get peace and security processes right or make them sustainable unless we take into account the lived experiences of the people that make up the population that are caught in various stages of conflict. And as Katrina was saying, often the more layered a person's identity is, the more complex or dangerous conflict situations become for them. So to be able to see things with an intersectional lens, we need to have the experiences of people with layered identities sharing their perspectives and being a part of the work on women, peace, and security. And we need to ensure that the agenda is inclusive of women in all of their diversity of identities. For me, I think that my own work towards queering the women, peace, and security agenda lies in sitting with more discomfort and recognizing that I may have, in the discomfort of recognizing what I may have overlooked, that we've been working on, what we've been working on may have had limitations, that I make assumptions and that others around me do too. And in order to get the perspectives required for more inclusive peace, we need to be intentional about creating space for voices of people representing different groups and seeking their participation in processes relating to their peace and security. So this is certainly a time when many groups are feeling very exposed and vulnerable, and when people are being even more marginalized because of their identities, and conversations like the one that we're having now allow us to connect, which helps fuel courage, and then it helps us to move forward with compassion and a greater conviction that peace is only possible when it includes us all. So thank you again to WCAPS Canada, to the WPSNC, and to the CCYPS and Interpares for organizing us to have this space, to have this discussion today. Thank you. Merci.
Merci, Mary. We're very grateful to be able to have allies like you within the systems. And thank you for these thoughtful reflections, personal and also diplomatic reflections about the current situation that we are all facing and this need for intersectional considerations within our work, and also seeing these individuals who face additional barriers due to their layered identity being able to be seated at the table. Now I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker, Dr. Jamie Hagan. I'm very glad that, Jamie, you've taken a few moments of your time to be with us. I know that you're across the pond and that it's quite late for you, so thank you so much. So Jamie is a lecturer in global politics at the University of Manchester. Jamie is one of the pioneers of queering women, peace, and security. If you've looked it up, you've probably seen her name once or twice at least. And so we wanted you, Jamie, specifically to be able to share with us a little bit about how this came to be. How did this space, this subfield of women, peace, and security really emerge, and where do you see it going? So over to you, Jamie. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for creating this space for continuing this conversation. I am calling in from Belfast, where I lived until August, but I'm back for a conference. So, yeah, so I started thinking about querying women, peace, and security when I learned about women, peace, and security through working with Global Network of Women Peace Builders and Peace Women. And while there's this really strong and robust, certainly legacy of women's peace building work, but even in the internationalization space of kind of what ends up being called capacity building quite often. I was a bit perplexed as someone who was kind of like, as a lesbian who's across different organizing spaces, um, was seeing this gap in attention to LGBTQ experience. So my curiosity about this work really started from just kind of where are the lesbians? You know, that question, which we can turn to Cynthia Enlow's work on where are the women, and certainly from this legacy of feminist queer scholarship and organizing. I really was curious about what it was, just kind of like where are they in the room, and how are we kind of recognizing this parallel and intersecting movement work of addressing patriarchy and fighting for gender justice across movements, recognizing that it is quite often queer and trans folks that are at the forefront of these different movements for justice and for peace. And so I then started writing a bit about challenging the heteronormative and cisgender assumptions, the idea that everyone's straight in these spaces, because it didn't match with what I was seeing and who I knew. And so we now have work by that you've been leading, and that other folks that we'll get to hear from today. So again, thank you so much for organizing this space. But um, queer people have always been a part of this, and quite um, often I find out that people knew lesbians were part of organizing, were really central to some of the movement, women's peace building movement work, but perhaps for various reasons didn't include that identity as part of how they framed their organizing. And I think we're seeing in the youth peace and security movement, and what's been really exciting to me to see is really claiming this front and center. And also like this organizing for Palestine, seeing so much like Queers for Palestine as being front and center, no pride in genocide. And this is something that is again I've never been able to understand gender as something separate than thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity, but I did realize in this working across some women, peace, and security spaces that um, while perhaps it wasn't an intentional exclusion, there was some assumptions operating that did lead to leaving out LGBTQ organizing. And so I would say that I definitely began doing this work in kind of this let's invite LGBTQ people in, but at the same time, I think there's this constant project that we do need to take very seriously about when it's very strategic to target trans people and to target sort of make claims about there's not that many LGBTQ people, or it's too radical a topic to bring up right now. And I've been most motivated to look at that within Western sites, because in my view, I do think that what I've seen is sometimes these organizations that have the power and the privilege to potentially fund and research and lift up queer organizing are perpetuating harms of continuing to exclude, continuing to promote some assumptions. And unfortunately, I do think that we're seeing a crisis moment now where these definitions that have been leveraged around what gender really means, around who peace is for, are leading to incredibly damaging legal decisions that now have a lot of weight of the law behind them, which were assumptions that were kind of being perpetuated behind closed doors in organizations that, we've worked with, or in different spaces where it's kind of what goes into grant funding and things like that. But this is why I think this counter insistence on um, challenging what we mean by queer and what we mean by peace and who women are, is so important. And just like showing up and continuing to say we're here, we're doing this work for LGBTQ organizations, and sort of I do see my position as someone who is working in the US and the UK as speaking back to a lot of predominantly white cisgender or organizational leaders or conveners that are working on women, peace, and security for 15, 20 years, to have this commitment and accountability to inviting LGBTQ people in, but not only that, to actually passing the mic in terms of who the experts are on this work, especially, as I said, as this absolute crisis point where I think it's also important to highlight that I'm seeing this sense of understandable loss and frustration about what do we do now with women, peace, and security, as we're getting in the US for sure, a gutting of whatever criticisms we have about the militarization and the limitations of like what radical work can be done through WPS. It's absolutely under attack. And so there's this almost, I see a little bit of this frustration at the same moment that I'm seeing the most LGBTQ people engaging in places like CSW, or looking to CEDA, or being active in writing shadow reports, and like really learning some of like what WPS is, and being in it's saying like, yeah, like we want to be in these spaces. So I think that part of what spaces like this, which I know is part of what folks here are thinking about, is sharing resources and really having these networks. I'm most excited about feminist and LGBTQ collaborations, these collaborations across spaces, especially as we have to be really creative in what language we're using, and how or what we're calling the work we're doing, as we're having to like kind of be fugitive in it in some ways, because we're not able to necessarily get funding or convene in some of the same ways that we might have previously. And in that sense, I think allyship is more important than it's ever been, in the sense that, it doesn't mean we don't do it. It means we have to be really creative and in solidarity about how we do this work. So I will just say that I definitely get hope and excitement from seeing cross, women, peace, and security, youth, peace, and security organizing, queer humanitarianism, like as an emerging being like in quotes, but we're starting to see it more convened spaces around this. It's a bit of a contradiction that at the one hand you're seeing what I've seen much more defeated frustration in terms of the way that WPS is under attack, but I'm also seeing this space opening up where we can collaborate across movements. So yeah, again, thank you for inviting me to share a bit about the trajectory I've seen in terms of having been working on this for about 10 years. I didn't really speak much about Colombia because I know we have Susanna here who will be able to share about that, but hopefully we'll be able to talk about that a bit more later. But over to you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for sharing these reflections. And yes, we're going to turn directly to the panel, and our first panelist you've already named. So I'd like to welcome all four of our panelists today. Maybe we can spotlight all four at the same time. I would like to welcome Maria Susana Parelta Ramon. I hope I did that right. I did that justice. Thank you. who is a Colombian expert on queering, peace, and security, and a partner of Inter Perez, a member of our network. I also am glad to welcome Francois from the Guardians of Equality movement, and originally from Syria, now based in Canada. Thank you for being here. I'm also glad to see some familiar faces from within our network as well. So I have welcoming Alexandria Bohemier, the chair of the Queering Youth Peace and Security Working Group from the Canadian Coalition for Youth Peace and Security, and Shane Wong, the co-author of Beyond Tokenism, the toolkit from the Canadian Coalition for Youth Peace and Security. So each panelist will have a turn to answer 2 different questions. I'll do one round and then I'll do the second question in the second round. I'll give each of you 3 to 4 minutes to answer. Please try to be concise. I know we have a lot to say, but we're trying to keep some space for dialogue as well. So I'll get right into it. Susanna, starting with you. Can you please tell us about opportunities that exist to strengthen collaboration and solidarity between grassroots queer peace builders and mainstream peace and security institutions, especially within the WPS and YPS implementation processes? We know you were so involved in the Colombian process, and so we'd love to hear more about that. Over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you everyone. I'm sorry I came up, I had a mix with the time, since in the northern hemisphere you change times, so I thought it was later, but I'm fine, I'm good, I'm here now. Thank you everyone for having me. It's great to see familiar faces, and it's amazing to meet new colleagues and new work from the field. So I'm excited to hear all about your work. So, well, the opportunities are, I think, in my opinion, luckily, numerous. What I believe is the main reason why those collaboration possibilities exist is because queer movements or queer grassroots organizations or leaders, we ask questions that nobody else wants to ask because those questions seem already answered. For example, what is the meaning of being a man? What is the meaning of being a woman? That is not something that is usually asked, not when you're talking about peace and security institutions, which are worried about the real dangers, no, which are violence, which is the meaning of either the presence or the absence of guns, and which is also translated as acts of, for example, killings or injuries. So those are very superficial views of reality. And I know where those things come from, no? From a very strong sense of horrors. But what the queer movement does is that it adds texture to those already oversimplified realities. And that is where possibilities arise. From the Colombian context, and I can mention a few, which later I can sort of go more in depth about that, would be, for example, consultation processes, either with other organizations or with state members. What was useful was before we started having specific conversations about norms, laws, judicial decisions, we had conversations about basic meanings of stuff that everyone already thought was defined, as, for example, the definition of gender or the definition of peace building. What happened a lot of times in Colombia was that peace building activists that came from the queer movement didn't think of themselves as peace builders. No, they thought they had a specific liberal agenda that required the liberal state to exist. But once they got into the conversation about how is it that what they do when they ask for equal rights or equal pay or representation and those liberal sort of claims, they realized that they were also partaking in peace building efforts for everyone, not only for those queer people that they represented, but for everyone in a peaceful society. So the first thing that helped us was sort of get the consensus that nothing was defined prior to our meeting. So that was useful. Then what was also very good for the Colombian context was that we did some exchange of knowledge. So what feminists, for example, knew more in depth about keeping records of violence, how to protect themselves in a daily life kind of manner, how to litigate cases, for example, in criminal scenarios. That was translated or sort of given to the queer movement or to the peace and security institutions. And then what they knew was given to the queer movement. So that knowledge exchange was very fruitful. And since nothing was already defined, we could come with new definitions, for example, of security. So security is not only the absence or the presence of armed men, but it's more about being able to be who you are freely without anyone violently being an obstacle for you. And just to end, so I know we have a lot of important comments here, so I want to hear you. What I want to say is that the main opportunity is the opportunity to notice. The queer movement and the queer activism, the queer voices raise awareness about a scar that nobody wants to see in peaceful times, because peaceful times are presented as perfect, no? And prior to the violent events. But queer people, we know, and we bring and we shine a bright light on a scar that is the result of a mixture of discrimination during peaceful times. So once you give your attention to that scar, and once you can realize that peaceful times were not as perfect as you thought, and that small things and small acts of being seen, being called, imagining your own prospect of life, how those things exist in your daily tiny life, will amount to a huge definition of community, nation, some place as big as you want it to be, where you can actually feel safe and where you can actually pursue your own happiness without any shred of either shame or fear. And I would say that that is the main opportunity, to create new meaning and to find new knowledge that you can improve with that intersectionality.
Thank you so much, Susanna. We're really grateful that you were able to even come first as a panelist, because you really frame also some of the conversations. So great organizing on the part of the team. I had no doubt you've always been a brilliant speaker, but I think it's a really good way to see it, this idea of a scar and trying to understand how structural violence continues to perpetuate even in times of peace. And so peace and security is not simply about the absence of war, which a lot of WPS activists and feminists have pushed for, but really going beyond just the narrow box of advocating for that concept. Now I'd like to turn over to Francois, welcoming Francois with us. Francois, in your work, which is on a broader spectrum, we'd love to hear from you, from your perspective, what queering peace and security looks like from a practical standpoint. So any thoughts on your end?
Okay, so it seems you really know a lot about me, because clicking on me as a word practical is really important, because first, thank you so much, and thank you, Susanna. Many terminologies you mentioned, it's really inspiring me. And a practical, it's an important word for me. I have been an activist since I was 16 years old, and I didn't know I was an activist at that time, but I had to do and write and speak out loud, because my father, he passed away under torture due to his political opinion. And due to my also activism, I get kidnapped by a radicals group and tortured me severely with a broken head, noise, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know even myself I was a risk or risking this system. And so I have learned in a very young age how important it is to be practical, because the things that I used, I faced firsthand as a war survivor, my kidnapping twice, and then the death penalty when I was 20 years old only. I know very well how important is really to work on a practical actions, because we have something in Arabic says, the people who are being tortured is different than the people who are counting the torture. So it's deeply important. It's not just about being practical. It's not about you don't feel the people. It's you feel the people to extend that you need the practical actions to move forward. So in a practical, and as an individual from a war zone, intensely now, we have we always LGBTQIA plus individual, to LGBTQIA plus individual. Um, it's like always something, a cause. It's being used in a political influence, if it is like from the West or from the East. And there's multiple examples that's happened in the past few years, because, for example, that talking about the wars that's happening, we know like in Syria, there is multiple influence from like Russia, Iran, the West, US, and other countries. And some countries would find the LGBTQIA plus groups, considering them as a Western axis. And like, for example, one of the analysis that I wrote, it was about like how Iran influenced the Near East, which is the Levant, and did a parallel, like an attacks in parallel, like in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, and it ended up in a very harsh law in Iraq before starting the war, you know, with like this war that started with 7th of October, and then like what's all of this happening in Gaza. So likewise in other countries like Ukraine, where they adopted more new laws to get closer to the Western to the Western side. So it could look in multiple ways in the wars, where some countries or sides of the conflict would use us to implement a certain agenda. So this is just giving a real example as how LGBTQIA plus individual are not just like about they are for real part of the global security issue and the regional security issues. And personally, I'm very like really caring about this topic as a youth activist and a policy practitioner, but at the same time as a queer, because we always like when I like I'm referring to my personal experience because I believe it's like the testimony that I could give and tell an examples how it could look in real life. Because when I started my activism, like I didn't know, again, like it was called activism. I was like writing things, and they then considered it as a something big. And even at that time and till recently and till the moment, I keep hiding my age in multiple places, because when I was 18 years old, I entered a workshop about the constitution in Syria, like how they can do interim and transition institution after the conflict. And even I wrote on the list that I'm 23 years old and I was 18 at that time. So even like I didn't give the real age, or basically I lied to my age because I wanted to get in, and I have a perspective I want to give. Many people, they were saying like, oh, he's 23, what he is doing here? And many people, they really wanted to kick me out, like with no reason. There's no crime I committed. There is no harassment, nothing bad, not even dropping a water somewhere as a child. Just I was participating, and even to be honest, I was the best one who was speaking some English terminologies in the workshop. Other like patriarchal man, like they were like sitting and saying like the very easiest way about everything. So youth and queering security is like, because we are involving about our own security and about our communities. If it's like about directly about our cause, such as like the LGBT, like the queer community, or about our youth community, but also as a broader cause, we are being forbidden to participate in our affairs. So we face all of this, like even like, and that's also referring, sorry, I have so many ideas and I'm trying to put them together. And that's also referring about what Jamie mentioned in the beginning about the intersectionality and the multiple vulnerability, I would call it. Like when you're being like a young gay refugee, internally displaced, whatever, altogether, a newcomer in a far country, and then you need to handle everything together. So that's also refer again for like when being youth, gay, trying to participate in the public policy, and everyone trying to fight you back and to get you out, regardless if you are talking about the like at that time I wasn't like participating as a queer individual. I was participating as a normal human being, but young enough to not be accepted in a countries like the Middle East, you know. So that's how it looks like to be involved in general, like in the public policy, and specifically in anything related to the women, like to the peace and security. If it's like queer youth, queer peace and security, or youth peace and security, it's like about the inclusion and the people being there for the security and peace. And again, and also there's like not just it's not just about inclusion. Like even many times I tell them, like even if I'm thinking about it from a profit perspective, like or productive perspective, including youth, it is important. There is many things that they could provide. Like everyone, every individual, and every communities can provide something different than the others, and including the youth people. Like I mean, even if you will talk in a biological way, like youth people, they might be important because they might take a very courageous decision. If it's like stereobiological, like whatever, like I'm just giving an example, it's not necessarily to be like a truly real, but every group could provide something, and we're losing so much, and that's why we're seeing a lot more more escalation in the region, and less solutions, because we are not using the resources we have. Basically, like you have millions of people, and you're using like only very few group, and they have very limited perspective about them. But what about the rest? And it's not just about the rest, but also it's about all of us. So like everyone will lose if we don't include, and that's what we are losing in our region, I believe.
Thank you so much, Francois, for sharing some of these reflections, and also your personal, experience with us, and trusting us with this experience that you're sharing. We're really glad that you're with us. I know that you're also in Europe right now, and so timing is a challenge. And so thank you for joining us. I mean, we'll have a second question for you later in the panel discussion, but we're really grateful for this initial conversation and kind of framing some of these experiences that you've had, although some of them being incredibly difficult. We're glad that you're here, and we feel personally that we're stronger because you're part of these conversations. And so
thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Of course, Fasa, thank you. You were talking about young people. You were giving the example of young people. And so I want to jump to some of our panelists who are working in the area of youth, peace, and security. So I'd like to introduce Alexandria, and I'd like to ask you, Alex, while Queering Peace and Security originally started with the women, peace, and security landscape, as we heard already, what are maybe some unique entry points that are offered through the youth, peace, and security agenda, and how these intersections could come to be in fruition?
Wonderful. Thank you, Katrina. And yes, this has been, I feel like there's so much overlap, which is really awesome between some of the panelists. So many things you, Francois and Susanna, were sharing. And I was like, yes, we're seeing this so much in our work too. So just very happy to be part of this conversation. I think many, first learned about queering peace and security within the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. And as someone who works a little bit more closely within the youth, peace, and security space, I quickly kind of began to notice the different limitations in queering women, peace, and security as a standalone. There was a lot of different gaps that we were able to identify, especially when it was coming to how gender diversity and youth leadership intersect. And I realized that the Youth, Peace, and Security agenda offers some uniquely powerful and what I would say are often overlooked entry points. Unlike Women, Peace, and Security, which was originally framed around a binary understanding of women, the Youth, Peace, and Security agenda emerged from diverse youth movements around the world, many of which were led by queer, trans, and gender diverse youth. From the beginning, youth, peace, and security has been grounded in lived experience and intersectionality. Its 5 pillars, participation, protection, prevention, partnerships, and disengagement and reintegration, create natural and necessary openings for queer inclusion in peace and security. Women, peace, and security can often be constrained by institutional gender frameworks. In contrast, youth, peace, and security centers young people's realities that are fluid, complex, and deeply affected by overlapping forms of violence and marginalization, which we've heard from the other panelists so far in their examples. This, to me, makes youth, peace, and security particularly well suited to engage with queer and trans youth whose security needs and peace-building contributions are frequently overlooked or ignored. The Canadian Coalition for Youth Peace and Security recently published a policy brief called No Peace Without Pride, which explores a lot of this in more detail, and we will share a copy of that in the chat so folks can access it. In this policy brief, we highlight how the Youth Peace and Security Agenda's partnerships pillar creates space for reciprocal and co-creative relationships between young queer peace builders and institutions. These partnerships aren't just about inclusion. They're about shared power, knowledge exchange, and recognizing the leadership that queer youth are already bringing to peace building. The participation pillar also provides a critical avenue to move beyond tokenism. It calls for queer youth not just to be consulted, but to also define priorities, shape policy, and hold institutions accountable. This is especially important in the Canadian context. Although Canada does not yet have a formal Youth Peace and Security National Action Plan, there has been significant engagement by youth peace and security actors and queer activists in the processes around Canada's national action plans on women, peace, and security. In the absence of a YPS national action plan, queer youth have still been able to shape youth peace and security conversations, pushing for concrete commitments to inclusion and accountability in existing frameworks, including our national action plans on women, peace, and security. And finally, the disengagement and reintegration pillar gives us another essential entry point. Queer youth are disproportionately criminalized, excluded from reintegration programs, and targeted by extremist or hate-based narratives. Applying a queer lens to this pillar helps us advocate for trauma-informed, rights-based integration programs that are reflective of and responsive to the needs of queer youth. So while queering peace and security may have emerged from women, peace, and security spaces, and there's a lot of important work that's still happening there, I personally believe that it's within the Youth Peace and Security agenda that we're going to be able to find transformative potential to reimagine what inclusive, community-driven peace building can really look like. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. And folks, if you're interested in reading more, Alex's thoughts are out into the world in many of the WPSNC's publications and policy analyses, a lot in the recent years around the National Action Plan, of course, that came out last year. I'm going to turn it over to Shane, kind of jumping on this bandwagon of asking ourselves about this question of inclusion. And I'm wondering, Shane, if you can talk to us a little bit from your perspective, how we can learn from people of color and the BIPOC community in the peace and security space in general about the role of allyship. And I ask this specifically because there's been a lot of calls, yes, here even in our conversation, but in general about allyship and the need for genuine allyship to women, young people, and queer individuals who are undergoing an additional threats at the moment. So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts and reflections on the matter.
Yes, thank you, Katrina. And I have to say, already listening to a lot of our speakers today, a lot of my thoughts on allyship have been like echoed back at me. So it's very reassuring in this conversation on how we can learn from each other. So allyship has a very important role with the diversifying of movements and ensuring they're more inclusive. So speaking from my own experiences as a young BIPOC woman who has worked as a researcher and a practitioner in peace and security, I've been very lucky and to have strong allies in my corner who have recognized the need for BIPOC inclusion, as well as the inclusion of diverse voices within peace and security work. So one of the first things often for me with diversifying movements is recognizing when a movement or a space is not diverse. So when I really think of allyship, it stems from how it has both supported me and how in turn I have chosen to pay that forward and be an ally to others as well. So this has been by questioning who is in the room, as Jamie mentioned, but also really questioning who is not in the room, whose voices are not presented in peace and security spaces, and questioning why aren't they? But it's more than simply posing these questions, but also what action is being taken? How are people using their privilege and power to challenge systems that have often been built on excluding diverse voices, such as BIPOC and queer ones? So in my life, as I said, I've been very lucky to have those people who have posed those questions and challenged systems, institutions, and norms to have voices like mine included in key spaces in peace and security, to challenge those who act as the gatekeepers to movements using the privilege they have been afforded by their identities to create more inclusive spaces for all. We talk often within activist and advocacy spaces of the proverbial table. When I think of allyship, I think of the youth peace and security space, where people with diverse identities have been coming together to dismantle these tables, to reshape the spaces where we're talking about peace and security, where the decisions that impact our lives are being made. Even women, peace, and security in the context of Canada is being reshaped with the inclusion of a youth, peace, and security lens that advocates for more inclusive spaces and the recognition of complex intersecting identities. So if we take this concept of allyship and apply it to queering peace and security, there is an important role here for allies in ensuring the inclusion of queer folks. So as an ally, for me, it's doing that look around the room to see who is and is not there, ensuring when we talk about diversity and peace and security that we are naming queer folks, using our privilege to uplift queer voices, ensuring they have space and meaningful space, and centering them within policy and practice. So I also want to take this a step further and note the need for internal allyship among our communities. So even when queer voices are included, how many of them are BIPOC queer voices? How many of them are from the most marginalized communities in our society? I've had friends and colleagues actually quite recently who are queer BIPOC folks express their experiences of isolation, silencing, and exclusion, resulting in them feeling doubly marginalized within their communities. So how, when queer voices are being included, it has largely been white presenting folks, or when BIPOC queer folks have been included, it's been in a very tokenizing manner, simply as to check a box and for people to say, hey, look, we did have a BIPOC person here, but not giving them the space to exercise power and voice within those institutions. And this doesn't just apply to queering peace and security. This also in turn applies within our BIPOC communities, where often queer folks are silenced and quite often erased. For example, I myself come from a culture where, and work in contexts where quite often queer folks are being erased and their voices continuously silenced within policy and practice in peace and security. So this by no means is an all-inclusive single solution answer to the question of allyship. I could really honestly talk to you all for hours on this concept of being an ally. Others will likely also have their own experiences. I do want to acknowledge that this is really grounded in my own experiences as a BIPOC feminist. And they will also have their own ideas of what it means to be an ally and what that looks like. So quite specifically, when I'm asked by others on how they can be an ally within peace and security as well as other movements, my most simple response is to say recognize, listen, uplift, and leverage. So recognize people's agency and voice. We don't empower people, we uplift people. Listen to what they're telling you and how you can support. Again, uplift, don't empower. We have power as marginalized people. We just need to, we're working to break into those spaces, as well as centering the voices of these communities and leverage as allies your privilege to create more inclusive spaces in peace and security.
Thank you so much, Shane, for sharing some of these reflections and personal learnings, I mean, that you've experienced yourself, but also reflected through the research and work that you've done primarily in Southeast Asia and in several other regions. I want to do a second round with our panel, but I know that we always run out of time. And as Shane was saying, we could speak about all of this for hours. And I do hope that we create other opportunities to continue to speak about this for hours, not just in our own echo chamber, but beyond, also being intentional of who we invite in the room, keeping in mind the protection concerns we have for the communities that are experiencing these violence attacks, but also making sure that we're not just talking to each other as allies, but we're bringing in other allies who can make up these spaces and break those silos. So what I'll do is I'm going to try and merge a little bit some of the questions I've received, some of them through the Q&A. I know there's others who may want to write directly back into the Q&A answers, and some that we've received through the RSVP form. And so I'll come back to you, Susanna, for a few minutes of reflection on the importance of breaking the silos between WPS and YPS and queering peace and security, And I'd love if you could give us a little bit of a perspective from the Colombian NAP process. We know that a National Action Plan came after years of work from civil society, much of which was led with you in the leadership seat in many occasions. And we are, celebrating the WPS NAP in Colombia as being so gender diverse and inclusive and having had such a robust process. But we'd love your perspective and sharing with some of our audience who may not be as familiar with the process. So over to you for any of those thoughts. Thanks, Susanna.
Kind and brilliant remarks. So what I can tell you about the Colombian, it would take me too long for tell you the whole Colombian NAP story, but in the end, I do feel very proud of what we did as a group of people, as Colombians, in regards of talking to each other and making it mean something. So it wasn't, as I think Francois was mentioning, just simulated inclusion. No, it was an actual conversation. And that's why it took us so long, because every time we met, we had new concerns, new questions, new ideas. The institutional offer changed because of budget cuts, because of healthcare urgencies, whatever. So the table was changing all the time. But given that a conversation had been started in honest terms, that was manageable. The thing with fake inclusion or with fake consultation is that when things change, everything falls apart. But since we already had a good conversation going, then we could navigate all of the difficulties, which were plenty. But I would say that one of the main things that I would like to give this panel, one of the main findings we had during the NAP process and during my previous work as representing victims of the Colombian armed conflict, and now as part of the judicial court that listens to those cases, is the bundle of discrimination that is going on between childhood and even teen years with queer and patriarchal discrimination in contexts of violence. So the main reason why kids don't go to school in Colombia is because of armed actors, because either the school is a more dangerous place or because the school is a safer place. And because the school is a safer place, then they don't allow them to leave their homes because their homes is a dangerous place. And if they know that you're going to a safe space, then they're gonna try to prevent you from doing that. Also, most armed actors are groups even before and now, because violence sadly is not over. And all of those armed groups are made, I don't have the number in my head right now, but it's about 70 or 80% by underage people. That makes no sense. These are kids' armies, which are being sent into even drug war, security concerns, to exhort people, to recruit more kids for the group. And then that has, of course, enormous consequences. But what we found, which was heartbreaking, was that when a kid or a teen displayed queer manners, which was something that their caregivers interpreted as they wanted, no? Either their hands, their way they were talking, who they were spending their time with, what kind of singer they were listening to, like any queer signal, then they handed them over to their armed groups. And this is a pattern of violence in Colombia. And instead of seeing the armed group as a threat for your kid, you see it as one possibility to change the sexual orientation or gender identity of your kid that you dislike. So even though you don't participate or you don't partake in war with that armed group, you see it as an opportunity for them to man up or improve or get right the sexual orientation or gender identity of your kid, which was heartbreaking, of course. And then that leads to a cycle of course, they have the worst time inside those groups because they're there, unlike everyone else who's there either for money or because they believe in the spirit of the group. They're there as a kind of punishment, no? To change their ways. So their sexual orientation and gender identity is openly known and openly seen as either disgusting, something that has to change. So that puts them at the highest risk, even inside the group. Now, of course, Add to that all of the miseries and dangers that partaking in war entails. But then if they find a way out of that, school is no longer an option. Like, they had missed everything regarding to accessing formal education, and therefore they have to start working so they can live off their own informal work, which leads to a cruel cycle of they're either impoverished or they have to, for example, find some way that they can survive. So this means sometimes making groups, but then nobody has formal education or formal jobs. And so on, the cycle continues. So this, for example, intersection between youth, queer, peace and security issues is very evident. It was very evident once we asked a few questions in those conversations that we were trying to have. But we didn't know it before, and nobody seems, at least in Colombia, nobody seems to be taking this torch, because the kids' rights or teenager rights are mostly advocated by conservative political leaders, no? So they wouldn't include how to allow their queer expression. What we found was that we couldn't even talk about queer kids because we didn't know. It was just kids that were finding out what their body was, what their desire was. Even they were not, like, they didn't have to be queer adults. They were just, I don't know, fragile, or men who were not the manly men. And that is, I would say, like the main bundle that I have seen in the Colombian context. And so far, no activism or legal work is being done to bring all of those things together. Like, you can find people worried about forced recruitment of minors. You can find people worried about minors who are not going to schools. You can find people worried about queer and like gender sexuality issues, but not the combination of the three. There is one petite difference with that, which is macro case 7 in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And that was thanks to my previous work in Colombia Diversa, supported by amazing people like Interpares and Jamie, which was giving these findings to the Transitional Court. And they found this pattern, no, of how one armed group was recruiting especially queer kids to just use them as like free meat for their war. And that is only starting, no, but it is the first time that a judicial authority has said that this pattern exists. So I believe that with the formal agenda of YPS and WPS and the queer perspective that is trying to bring both of those things together, I believe Colombia can give us a good surprise in the near future about how to implement something that works for all of these three issues.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you for, the almost the inspiring way of looking at it to see what possibilities even lie ahead in terms of how do we merge these agendas together and look at the intersectional factors as opportunities for inclusion, and not just as the barriers, identifying them, but how do we go forward in a way that does affect and change lives. And so thank you so much, Susanna. Francois, I'm going back to you with a question. Your last question, a second question for you. What steps, from your perspective, can peace and security actors take to support LGBTQ+ human rights defenders specifically in the work and organizing that they do?
Okay, thank you for the question. And again, for the question of practical steps. There's two things, there's 2 points. For the general thing and for the human rights defenders specifically. By the way, I came to Canada under a pathway for protection of human rights defenders at severe and extreme risk. So I'm again, like, I'm here, I'm between a few. I was sentenced to this. I was even hunted in Turkey when I was a refugee there. So if that program didn't exist, I wouldn't be here maybe. And but I'm perfectly here, and such a program and pushing to the policy to consider the human rights defenders, it's a global security issue. It's impactful. And there is many people, like I was the first person who came by this program And there's many people I'm hearing, and they are now coming to Canada from a very severe security situation. And the argument I believe it should be, it's always about the individual security in those matters. So the individual security terminology, it's being used for the human rights defenders, for the LGBTQIA individual, or anyone who face a security matter because who they are. Because now in Syria, there's like millions of people, maybe they might be at risk, but not but the people who are being an individual security risk, it's like a severe case. I mean, of course, all the people deserve this help and protection, but there is like to do this category for them and try to help as much as people and who deserve first. Sadly, this is the word because it has a limited capacity. Is about by pushing and and mobilizing about the individual security threats that that human rights defenders face. Also, there is another point, which is the navigation that I have been trying to promote in all my work. And now we are in a world which is very harsh. It's against all the causes we're talking about today. So it's not about we should leave the conversation or we should leave the work. It's actually, this is the real work that we are going to do, because politics or public policy is not about to learn how to work with your friends. Is about to learn how to work with your enemy. Everyone know how to work with their friends. So I think what today we need to learn really is to have less attitude, like with very like please accept my like very natural language, talking about the things with less attitude and more practical and navigation action. Oh, okay, I'm not talking to Alexa. Okay. So you know, I was in Qatar last month. Like, who would imagine? Like, I was doing a panel about inclusion and navigation in public and humanitarian policy in Qatar, where I'm being, if I get discovered as gay, I might be killed to death, blah blah blah. But like, and I am involved with multiple people that doesn't look like me, and they are not my vibe at all. And not like look like me. I mean, like look like me in the career or in the sector level, because we need to work with all the people, not just with the people like us. I mean, who I will influence, like to influence Susanna. Oh my God, like Susanna as an expert. Like this is not the work. The work is to go to the people who doesn't look like us and to work with the people. I will not call it enemy. I will call it the opposite of us. I think because sadly, we are seeing a lot in our activism that people they want to work or to work with the people like them, and attitude, yelling, pushing is important. But also, I believe now today in our activism and our movement, there is like an extra mainstreaming to this approach, and now we are needing more a practical and navigation approach. Believe me, like personally, I have so many stories. I wish like one day we could tell each other how we influenced people that like you wouldn't imagine. Oh my God, those are influenced to certain agenda. I mean, they would implement something for us just because we changed the narrative. It's not like it's still the same request, but we didn't. We changed a narrative that would suit them, would suit their benefit, and talk centered on their benefit to get our benefit, because the system is hard and we can't deal with it otherwise. You know, I wouldn't call it manipulation, but I would call it like really a practical again, because now we are at a level where people are like being hurted, people being dying, people being tortured, and we should feel them enough to be practical enough. And thank you very much for everyone.
Thank you, Francois. I think your call to focus on the practical and the actions is very loud and clear. And I think that that's really well suited in a time where we're seeing again this idea of regression of rights, attacks and targets against the communities that are already vulnerable and having these issues around protection and the ability to live and enjoy their rights. I'm going to turn over to Alexandra. I know that we are coming close to the end of our conversation. Alexandra, as we turn towards the future, when we look ahead, what is needed from your perspective to help move queering peace and security from theory to action, kind of leading or jumping off of what Francois was saying? How do we bring this to reality?
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. I think that's a really great transition between some of what Francois was sharing. I think for me to move from queering peace and security, to kind of move this from theory to action, we have to really begin by naming The fundamental truth that is most peace and security frameworks, even those that claim to be inclusive, are still grounded in cisnormative and heteronormative assumptions and approaches. And I think addressing that requires more than just representation. It requires a structural reimagining of whose security we're saying counts, whose voices are shaping the policy, and what we're saying peace actually means. The Canadian Coalition for Youth Peace and Security's policy brief outlines a few different concrete pathways to try and help to make this shift happen. First, we need sustained, well-resourced mechanisms for queer youth to shape policy. This means directly funding queer-led peace-building organizations and ensuring that queer youth are part of formal policy design, not just being consulted after the fact. It also means embedding queer inclusion into national action plans and other means of implementing the Women, Peace and Security and Youth Peace and Security agendas. We also must build relationships rooted in trust and reciprocity. Too often, queer communities are approached through extractive consultations or short-term engagements. And true partnerships mean co-creating programs, sharing design-making power, and building processes of accountability that respond to community needs, especially in contexts where queer people have historically or are presently being harmed by security actors. Third, we need to invest in queer knowledge and leadership. And I think, obviously, just even hearing from folks here today, I think that's a very clear step for many of the participants at the session. This can include funding research that documents the experiences of queer people in conflict zones and peace building, especially those who are racialized, displaced, or navigating multiple forms of marginalization. But it also means ensuring that this research informs practice. Queer expertise must be treated as core and not just peripheral to peace and security policy. Fourth, we need to strengthen queer representation in peace processes and decision-making bodies. We've heard this again, and I feel like I say this very, very often, but queer peace builders are already doing this work. We just need to make sure and ensure that they are present at the tables where decisions are being made and that they have the support that is needed to participate meaningfully and safely. And finally, we need global solidarity in the face of rising anti-rights movements. We've heard this a few times from the panelists today, but queering peace and security is not just about inclusion. It's about disrupting the very systems that perpetuate insecurity. That requires us to challenge discriminatory laws and narratives, protect queer rights defenders, and ensure that multilateral institutions stand firm in advancing human rights for everyone. If queering peace and security is going to move from being a theoretical framework and to move into more practice, then we need to shift our broader approach to peace and security to an approach that demands courage, long-term investment, and collective action so that we're able to build a more peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable society that leaves no one behind. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. And speaking of leaving no one behind, our favorite phrase, or some folks' favorite phrase, I want to ask Shane to come in for your last reflections, because I know that you have worked a lot on this question of inclusivity, but more so about tokenism in these spaces. We talk about the infamous table, as you referred to earlier. And so I'm wondering what you think that needs to be done to make sure that queer communities, LGBTQIA+ communities are actually meaningfully included, and that their presence is not simply an act of tokenism.
Yes, so the Canadian Coalition for Youth, Peace and Security, or CCYPS, has really been leading and advocating for institutions, organizations, etc., to think more critically about the concept of tokenism, encouraging such groups to look at their structures, their policies, their practices, and consider how they've been enabling and perpetuating tokenistic behaviors, which often result in young people and other marginalized communities holding little voice and power within key spaces, and challenging them to address these issues in concrete and meaningful ways. So probably one of the most recent, aside from the policy brief that Alex mentioned, that we've been advocating for addressing issues of tokenization, or as what we in CCYPS like to call detokenization, is through the Beyond Tokenism toolkit, which was released last September, which stems from research that CCYPS conducted in 2021. So we pulled data from surveys that we conducted, which were primarily completed by young people in Canada, but we did also have global participants. And it explores the limitations and barriers many young people face in civic spaces due to exclusionary and tokenistic practices. So to kind of give some examples we found through this research, this includes young people being included merely to say there was a young person in the room and to just check off a box. Having young people who meet certain criteria primarily being included, which has often led to white, cis, heterosexual individuals, often men, being included while excluding diverse and marginalized youth such as BIPOC, queer folks, young people living with disabilities, or youth from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And when youth are included, many have experienced silencing from older colleagues if they are perceived as challenging the status quo. So from findings such as this, we developed some resources to help detokenize institutions, organizations, and movements. So one of the tools that I really like to suggest that individuals or organizations start with is the self-assessment framework, which poses some really important and poignant questions such as, are youth from diverse backgrounds represented? Are their voices genuinely considered? Do young people have a say in decisions that affect them? Are they involved in setting agendas and determining the outcomes? So one of the things I truly like about these questions as both a BIPOC youth advocate, but also as an ally to queer and other marginalized communities, is that it really challenges not just the exclusion of youth, but the exclusion of diverse youth. So one of the goals we had with the toolkit was to really encourage individuals, institutions, organizations to think about how they're structured and how they understand young people within that structure, challenging folks to think about their biases and how their biases can make spaces non-inclusive. So in addition to the self-assessment framework, we also created templates for monitoring and evaluation, examples of how to collect feedback from young people, and models for youth-adult partnerships, which include mentorship and capacity building. So now you may have noticed that what I've explained is quite broad in scope, and it's not necessarily QPS focused directly, but it is QPS inclusive. When we wrote this toolkit, the intention was for it to be adaptable, recognizing that others operating in different contexts and who have different focus areas can also benefit from this work. It also recognizes that people have complex intersecting identities. Again, I myself come to my work as a young woman of color. Someone else may be a young binary individual living with a disability. So part of this process of detokenizing civic spaces is recognizing the complex identities of others and creating inclusive and meaningful spaces for all. So beyond tokenism and No Peace Without Pride, the policy brief that Alex mentioned, are just only two examples of the work that the Canadian Coalition has done. But as a coalition, we do continue to advocate for detokenization and push for more inclusive peace and security spaces in Canada and globally, with the hope and goal of creating more inclusive frameworks, as well as models that recognize diverse voices and lived experiences.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you for closing us out with some of these resources or outputs that have been produced to try and support the framing of the restructuring that is envisioned. So folks, as we bring this conversation to a close, I'm honored to welcome two final voices to our virtual table to reflect on some of what we've heard, but also share their own perspectives. So first we'll hear from Kin Vance Vance Mubanga, Director of Programs and Partnerships at EGAL Canada, one of our very and now active members of the Women, Peace and Security Network. We're very glad to have you, Kim, with us, and we're glad to be able to elevate the work that EGAL is doing across the country and outside the country. And so we're glad to hear from you. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And normally I would be calling in from Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, on the traditional and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people. But today I'm calling in from the Okanagan, the traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. Yeah, just a fantastic panelists, amazing comments. And I think I'm going to maybe frame my concluding remarks in one of the most recent activities that EGAL has been engaged with, and that has been as chairing the Pride 7 group, which is a group that is seeking engagement status within the G7 space. And I think, like so many of the conversations that have happened today are resonating right now in the news as we see the G7 leaders concluding their discussions, and so much of it has been focused on the idea of peace and security. And I go back to Mary's comments at the beginning around how sexual orientation and gender are still some of the most challenging areas, and we're seeing that. We're already seeing in that space that peace and security is being framed as arming countries, right? That is how the leaders right now are discussing peace and security. And we've heard a lot from the panelists about how important it is to be in this space and asking questions. And that is crucial. That is crucial. But we also have to acknowledge, and I think Alex and others talked about this, that in some cases, they already know the answers to the questions. The exclusion is quite deliberate. For instance, all of these leaders know that war and violence weaken the rule of law. That's a given. And we all know, and they know, that when rule of law breaks down, who are the most vulnerable people in those scenarios? And there's countless pieces of data across the world to show who are those most vulnerable people. And in every country in the world, there's documentation that LGBTIQ people, women, marginalized communities are those vulnerable and marginalized populations. So we already know that they're most at risk in those kinds of scenarios, and that really there's no country in the world where those populations aren't at risk. I want to pick up on a point too also that Francois made about how being part of the LGBTI community puts them at risk in terms of being identified as, being linked to the West in some way. And I think that's a really important question to pose. But I think those of us who are in the West also need to challenge our Western governments who also use LGBTI communities as political footballs in that conversation. And one of our recommendations to the G7 leaders was to never use the protection of LGBTI communities as defense for war and armed conflict. And just today, I was listening to a very prominent Canadian personality who I've never heard talk about feminist issues. I've never heard talk about LGBTI issues, wading into the conversation on the issue of bombing Iran, and using women and LGBTI people as a rationale for doing that. And so we have to resist that at every turn. The other, Alex, you posed the question, what does peace mean? We have to ask those really fundamental questions when we're having this conversation. Is it just the absence of war? If we know that peace means that the rule of law has broken down, well, what happens to the point where we're seeing an outright, and I'll use the term hunting season on queer and trans people in countries where there's not necessarily armed conflict, but where there's open season on those communities and increased impunity for those who commit that violence? Do we call that a peaceful situation? We have documentation from the UN expert on sexual orientation and gender identity around large patterns of forced displacement, for instance, on LGBTI people. And yes, some of them are coming from what we think of as traditional conflict zones, but many of them are not coming from what we traditionally think as conflict zones. Yet we have an ongoing crisis of forced displacement for our communities. And I guess the last thing I'll say, because I know we want to kind of wrap things up, but just on that point about what does peace mean, EGAL offered a webinar a number of weeks ago in partnership with a number of other Canadian organizations on a pathway to Canada for US queer and trans folks. And we had over 1,000 people register for that webinar. So, this really does pose the question about what does it mean to be living in a peaceful situation, and how do we define what peace and security look like from a queer and trans analysis and lens. I want to thank all of you who were so excited about the linkage work that's happening between feminist and LGBTI groups. I think I'm seeing that too. I think in the face of the rising anti-gender movements around the world, that is crucial. It's necessary to be very intersectional and intentional about our work. I want to thank the youth movements who are really kind of expanding these notions, these binary notions, and forcing a broader conversation. You know, it's really heartening for those of us who've been doing this work for a long time to see that. And yeah, thanks everybody for their really important comments and insights.
Thank you so much, Kim. We're so grateful that you're here with us and that you were able to share some of these very nuanced reflections. As you say, it's a very pivotal moment. It's a moment where we have to come together in solidarity and ask ourselves these tough questions, and how do we have to change certain systems of knowledge and power in our own ways of working to make sure that we are truly being allies to one another and tackling these difficult moments together. Just as we close completely, folks, I'd like to welcome Princesa Calixte, who has a pre-recorded video. Unfortunately, Princesa could not be here live for other personal reasons, but Princesa is speaking to us as a fellow from the women. Sorry, I got a question in the chat and it prompted something, but sorry. Princesa is a fellow from the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security and Conflict Transformation, and also a member of the Canadian chapter. And so we'll hear from Princesa for closing thoughts.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. For those who don't know me, my name is Princesa Calixte, and I am a member of the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Conflict Transformation Canada chapter, and most recently WCAP's Pipeline Fellowship alumni. I'm sorry I haven't been able to join you all live, but I was truly honored to have been asked to give closing remarks for today's discussion. So first, I want to thank our organizers, WCAPS Canada, the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada, the Canadian Coalition for Youth, Peace and Security, and Interpares. I want to thank our moderator, Katrina, our amazing panelists for their very thoughtful discussions. And I also want to thank all those working behind the scenes to bring this event together in honor of Pride Month. So in closing, I really want us to reflect about what Queer in the Peace and Security agenda truly calls us to do. We know that it's not just about visibility or representation, but really about transformation and really shifting our focus away from binary and heteronormative frameworks that are exclusionary and disruptive. Queer and trans folks, especially queer and trans folks of color, have always been a part of this agenda, whether as organizers, as activists, as survivors, as leaders. And our goal really is to amplify their voices, to not let them be sidelined, to not let them be erased, as historically been done and continues to be done today. Queering the agenda is also about accountability. We need to ask ourselves these questions, are we and how are we funding queer-led initiatives? Are we truly amplifying the voices of queer youth peace builders and activists? Are we collecting inclusive data? Are we helping to dismantle legal and security institutions and systems that continue to marginalize and criminalize our communities? This is a very poignant discussion during very disruptive times where we are seeing true harm done to our communities in the Americas and of course across the world. So I truly hope that we've been able to come away with some fresh perspectives, some new ideas to help advance this work in whatever sector and area that you're working in. And let's truly commit towards building peace, justice, and sustainability that really affirms the dignity, the agency, and leadership of 2S LGBTQIA+ folks. So once again, thank you to our organizers, to our panelists. Thank you for joining our conversations today. I'm wishing you all a happy Pride, and I'm sending you so much care and solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Kim and to Princesa, and thank you again to all of our speakers, our wonderful co-organizers, and everyone who's joined us this evening, or very, very late evening for some of you who are joining us from outside the continent. As we reflect on the ideas shared today, I hope we can carry forward the reminder that queering peace and security is not a theoretical exercise. It is truly a political act. one that must be rooted in justice, solidarity, and lived realities of those who too often have been and continue to be excluded from these agendas. So let's continue to push for deeper inclusion, not just in our language, but in our policies and our partnerships and our practice. And thank you everyone again, and happy Pride.